So the simple Keynesian model, which is what we are going to begin with, starts with a very simplified story. We're going to go back to our circular flow, and I'm going to make some assumptions. So first, I'm not going to look at price levels, I'm not going to look at interest rates, things like that. I'll do a little bit, but not a whole lot on that. I'm not going to look at government, I'm not going to look at the rest of the world. I'll remind us of a few things, and then we're going to develop our model. So when we look at the economy, if you go back to how we measured the GDP, the real GDP, what we said is that by definition, real GDP is just whatever you produced in a given year in the economy. All right? That's all it was. And I said that by definition, I can measure this in one of three ways. I can measure it by looking at output, like value added. I can measure it by looking at incomes, which is who got the money, who got the revenues, and who got paid out of the production process. I could look at it by looking at expenditures, where it ends up going. I'm going to reserve that concept of expenditures later for a very new thing, so we're going to hold on to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure this out by using a really simple model. No government, no rest of the world, nothing. So in this very simple economy, I only have two major agents or actors. I've got firms and households. That's it, right? So what I want us to remember is that by definition, real GDP, that I'm going to call our GDP from here on out, is the same thing as real output and real income. So our GDP is a measure of the actual production. And by definition, it's also the same thing as the actual income, by which that's this year, that's what happened. Our GDP is Y, income, all of those. So real GDP is by definition output and also by definition final incomes for that year. No assumptions that that's going to remain the equilibrium level, but this is what I produced. By definition, my output is the same thing as someone's income, and it's the same thing as what I'm going to call exposed. And this is going to be a pretty important distinction. Expenditure. So by definition, according to how I measure the GDP, output, income, and exposed expenditure are all the same. So I'm going to start here, real GDP. This output I'm going to call capital Y. Capital because it's macroeconomic. Y because I've used that letter I for other things like investment and interest and so on. So capital Y is my total output, my total income exposed, my total expenditure exposed. It's the same thing as what I'm calling our GDP. Right? This output generates the income of households. Households use this income, they either consume or they save. They spend spending by households becomes revenue for firms. Firms themselves are also doing purchasing. And the firm's purchases I'm going to call investment. That's what I'm using I for. But right now I'm going to use this word exposed after the fact, because it's going to be really important to figure out how much of what the firms are spending is about things like purchasing plants, purchasing equipment, engaging in what is called gross fixed capital formation, for future production. That's part of what they're buying. They're also buying inventory. Nobody wants to be the firm where you show up at the shop and they don't have stock for you, right? You don't want to be the firm where somebody goes and says, hey, I'd like to buy a MacBook. There's no MacBook. No MacBook, no inventory. What you going to do? Oh, all right, I'll buy an IBM, right? You want some inventory. That's planned. But also sometimes you have unsold stuff left on your shelf as inventory. That's what I'm calling exposed. After the fact, you weren't able to sell the stuff. It's sitting there. So investment in this moment is exposed. It's not ex ante. We have to figure this distinction out. Ex ante is before the fact. Ex post is after the fact. So you produce stuff, our GDP became income of households. Some they saved, some they spent. To this you add firms' purchases. Simple economy, no government, nothing. Very simple economy. Some of this is purchases which I'm going to call gross fixed capital formation. Some of this is inventory, and some of this inventory is planned. Some of this is unanticipated, whatever it is. And by definition, when I complete the circuit, what I produced must by definition be equal to the income I generated, and must by definition be equal to where the stuff ended up, what people quote unquote purchased or were left with, planned or unplanned. Households purchase, firms purchase. Firms are also left with stuff, planned or unplanned. This is the circular flow in terms of your accounting matrices for GDP that you learned. Now here's an interesting question. When you look at this circuit, I can see I produce stuff. It becomes people's income. Some of it they consume. Additionally, some of it firms want to buy. And then there's some stuff left with them at inventory. And that's my total. What I do not as yet have is an analysis or theory of what sets the equilibrium level of production, the equilibrium level of income, what I'm calling Y. So Y is our GDP. I can trace it through accounting. I do not yet have a theory that explains to me what sets the level of Y. This is important. Remember, Y or our GDP is how I think of the business cycle, how I think of recessions, depressions, growth, booms, busts. So I want more than an accounting framework. I want an analysis, an explanation that helps me understand what's deciding what the total volume of production is. What decides? Is it high? Is it low? Is it big enough? Is it small enough? Is it too high? Is it too low? Right? For that, I need to do a bunch more work. In particular, I need to understand decision making and behavior of the key actors in this economy. So right now, all I've got is our GDP and a circular flow. I still do not have an explanation of what sets Y. And I need that explanation because the level of Y tells me the level of production. It tells me if I've got a recession. It tells me if I've got a boom. It tells me if I've got growth. And it tells me if I'm employing enough people. So we need to figure out what sets Y. And that is what we're going to do.